In 1945, an engineer named Percy Spencer is standing, a little too close to an active military radar set. And he reaches into his pocket, and his peanut cluster candy bar has turned into absolute mush.
Oh, man.
Right. He didn't know it yet, and honestly, he was probably just super annoyed about his ruined pants. But that melted chocolate bar was about to basically change every kitchen on planet Earth.
It really is. It's sort of the ultimate invisible origin story. You wake up, you stumble into the kitchen, you heat up yesterday's coffee, you check the weather on your phone.
Yeah, the morning routine.
Exactly. It all feels so domestic and safe and, well, completely divorced from history. But you are essentially interacting with the ghosts of a global conflict before you even finish your breakfast.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are taking you on a massive journey today to explore the immense, kind of hidden and enduring legacies of World War II. Our mission here is to show you how the seemingly mundane world you are sitting in right now was fundamentally forged in the fires of the 1940s.
And we have an incredibly diverse stack of sources to guide this exploration today. We're pulling from a historical overview of World War II's technological leaps, which is provided by the National WWII Museum.
Fantastic source.
Yeah, it really is. We also have a deeply poignant transcript from a Council on Foreign Relations panel, and they're discussing the documentary called Atomic Echoes.
Right, and we're also looking at a comprehensive academic paper by Abraham Kuhl-Nguyen. That one's on the origins and the end of the Cold War.
Then we pivot to a really fascinating legal analysis by Mary Jane Lopardo, looking at the unprecedented legal architecture of the Nuremberg trial.
And finally, we've got a striking art and science portfolio by Robertina Ubjani. She explores the literal chemical scars left at the bottom of our oceans.
Yeah, the connective tissue across all these seemingly disparate sources is just the sheer, overwhelming momentum of total war. I mean, it accelerates everything: technology, geopolitics, international law.
And ecological destruction, unfortunately.
That's right.
So, the device used to heat your morning coffee, the international laws protecting human rights, the political maps of the 20th century, and the toxic chemicals currently mutating jellyfish in the Adriatic Sea. They all share the exact same violent, transformative birthplace. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, I think we should start with that melted candy bar.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it illustrates perfectly how the sheer pressure of an existential conflict just, it bypasses decades of normal research and development friction.
Right, the technological spoils of war.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the cavity magnetron, because I'm willing to bet practically everyone listening has one in their house right now and has absolutely no idea how it works. Our source from the National WWII Museum actually brings this up as a critical turning point.
Yeah, so a cavity magnetron is, at its core, basically a high-powered vacuum tube that generates microwaves.
Okay.
During the early days of World War II, the British and the Americans desperately needed to improve their combat radar because early radar was incredibly bulky and it used these really long wavelengths, which meant it severely lacked precision.
Wait, let me stop you there for a second, because I want to make sure I really understand the mechanics here. Why does the length of the wave matter so much for precision?
Think of it like, imagine trying to feel the shape of an object with your hands while wearing incredibly thick winter gloves.
Okay, yeah.
Versus using your bare fingertips. Long radio waves will easily bounce off a massive object like a battleship, right?
Right, makes sense.
But they will wash right over something much smaller, like, say, a submarine periscope poking just out of the water. So to detect those small, critical targets, they needed microwave lengths. Shorter waves essentially provide a much higher resolution picture.
Oh, I see. So how does the magnetron actually create those shorter waves then?
It uses electrons and magnetic fields. So inside the tube, there is a heated cathode right in the center, and it shoots off electrons.
Okay.
And around it is this solid block of copper with hollow cavities cut into it. A really powerful magnet forces those electrons to spin in a circle around the cavities. And as the electrons whiz past the openings of those cavities, they create a resonant frequency.
Kind of like blowing air over the top of a glass bottle to make it whistle.
That is the exact principle, just, with electrons instead of air and electromagnetic waves instead of sound waves.
Oh.
Yeah, and this sort of electron whistling generates incredibly powerful short microwaves. So suddenly, Allied planes and ships could equip these relatively small devices and spot enemy U-boats and aircraft with devastating accuracy.
That's incredible.
What's fascinating here is that the source actually notes some historians argue this radar tech helped the Allies win the war even more than the atomic bomb did.
Which brings us back to Percy Spencer. He's testing one of these active magnetrons, and his candy bar melts. But how does blowing an electron whistle cook chocolate?
Well, microwaves happen to be the exact right frequency to excite water molecules.
Oh, okay.
The waves cause the water molecules inside the candy bar or, your leftover coffee to vibrate millions of times a second. That friction generates heat really rapidly from the inside out.
So it's literally just microscopic friction.
Exactly. So Spencer saw the melted chocolate, grabbed some popcorn kernels, put them near the magnetron, and they popped. He had essentially stumbled onto a byproduct of submarine hunting technology that would eventually become the commercial microwave oven.
It's just mind-blowing that something designed to hunt U-boats is now used to heat up a hot pocket.
Right.
But the cavity magnetron wasn't the only radar-related technology to make the jump to civilian life either. Let's talk about meteorology. Because if you're bouncing radio waves off enemy planes, you're inevitably bouncing them off other things in the sky, right?
Yeah, military radar operators during the war constantly complained about noise or clutter on their screens. They'd be tracking incoming bomber squadrons, and suddenly this massive amorphous blob would appear and totally obscure the target.
That's blinding, though.
Basically, yeah. And it turned out those blobs were storm systems. The microwave lengths were actually bouncing off raindrops.
So a military annoyance basically becomes a scientific goldmine.
Precisely. After the war, scientists realized that this clutter allowed them to see inside weather systems in real time. By measuring the time it took for the signal to bounce back, they could calculate exactly where a storm was.
Oh, wow.
And later on, by measuring the Doppler shift, which is just the slight change in frequency of the returning wave, they could tell which way the wind inside the storm was blowing, which allowed them to predict tornadoes.
So literally every time you open a weather app on your phone to see if you need an umbrella today, you are directly interacting with the post-war application of World War II combat radar.
You are.
And speaking of the phone itself, we really have to look at the computing aspect of this. The National WWII Museum source highlights the ENISE, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer.
Right. This is a massive conceptual leap. The concept of computing existed before the war, obviously, but it was largely mechanical, gears and physical switches.
Clunky stuff.
Very. But the war demanded rapid, unprecedented calculation power, specifically for ballistics.
Right, because firing an artillery shell isn't just pointing a tube and pulling a cord.
Not at all. If you are firing a shell miles away, you have to account for just a dizzying array of variables. The weight of the shell, the amount of propellant, the angle of the gun.
Sure.
But you also have to factor in air density, temperature, wind speed at different altitudes, and this is crazy, even the rotation of the Earth.
Wait, really? The rotation of the Earth?
Yeah. So creating a single firing table for one specific gun under one set of conditions could take a human mathematician days to finish.
The source actually mentions that computers was a job title back then, often held by women. But why couldn't they just, hire more human computers to do the math?
The sheer volume of new artillery being produced simply outpaced human calculation. They needed to calculate trajectories faster than a human hand could write. So the military funded the ENIC, and what it did was replace those slow mechanical gears with vacuum tubes, which have no moving parts.
I picture a vacuum tube as basically a fancy light bulb. So how does a light bulb do math?
Think of it not as a bulb, but as a gate. A vacuum tube can control the flow of an electrical current. It can turn the current on or off instantaneously.
Okay.
By wiring thousands of these tubes together, you create logic gates. If this tube is on and that tube is on, send a signal to a third tube. This is the absolute foundation of binary logic, ones and zeros.
The scale of this machine is almost comical compared to what we have today, though. The ENIAC took up 1,500 square feet. It had 40 cabinets, each standing 9 feet tall. It contained over 17,000 vacuum tubes and cost the equivalent of millions in today's money.
It was a behemoth, but it could calculate a 60-second artillery trajectory in 20 seconds.
Wow. Faster than the shell itself.
Exactly. Now, the machine wasn't formally completed until late 1945, so it missed most of the combat. But the U.S. government actually released the technology to the public in 1946. By proving that electronic computing was viable, it set off the miniaturization race that led directly to the microchips powering the device you're listening to this deep dive on right now.
The ultimate theme here really is necessity driving innovation. And nowhere is that desperation more apparent than in medicine. We're talking about millions of casualties, and the trauma treatments like blood transfusions, skin grafts, they just leaped forward. But the National WWII Museum points to one specific game changer, which is penicillin.
Yeah, Alexander Fleming discovered the antibacterial properties of penicillin mold way back in 1928. He noticed that this specific mold secreted a substance that destroyed surrounding bacteria.
Right.
But for over a decade, it was really just a laboratory curiosity. Fleming couldn't isolate the active ingredient in large enough quantities, and there was just no urgency to fund the massive industrial infrastructure required to figure it out.
Enter World War II. Because bullets and shrapnel are devastating, obviously, but historically, infection kills far more soldiers than the initial trauma. The need for an antibacterial treatment was no longer an academic pursuit. It was literally a matter of winning or losing the war.
Exactly. So American and British scientists pooled their resources to figure out mass production. They moved away from growing the mold on flat laboratory dishes and developed a process called deep tank fermentation.
What does that actually entail? It sounds a bit like brewing beer.
It's somewhat similar in scale, actually. They built these massive multi-story vats, but mold needs oxygen to grow, and if you just fill a vat with liquid, only the mold right on the surface gets any air.
Ah, that makes sense.
So the breakthrough was constantly pumping sterile, filtered air through the liquid while giant mechanical agitators stirred the mixture. This allowed the penicillin mold to grow exponentially throughout the entire volume of the tank.
The logistics of that are incredible, especially when you consider the stakes. The source notes they managed to produce 2.3 million doses just in time for the Normandy invasion in 1944.
And without that supply, the casualty rate from infected wounds after D-Day would have been catastrophic. It completely changed the public's relationship with medicine. Post-war advertisements called it a miracle drug, and it essentially established the modern pharmaceutical industry's reliance on antibiotics.
So heating leftovers, checking the weather, typing on a computer, taking an antibiotic, all echoes of World War II. But as revolutionary as radar and penicillin were, they were designed to save lives or protect assets. The most famous invention of the war redefined exactly how we destroy lives.
The atomic bomb. Yeah, this is where the technological legacy becomes profoundly heavy. We have to shift from the mechanics of war to the lingering human toll.
Our next source is a transcript from a panel discussion hosted by the Council on Foreign Relations, and they were analyzing a documentary called Atomic Echoes, produced by Victoria Kelly and Corinne Tanabe. What makes this documentary so significant is that it actively bypasses the high-level history of the Manhattan Project and zooms in on the completely untold intimate stories of the American atomic veterans and the Japanese survivors, the hibakusha.
It really bridges the gap between the geopolitical and the deeply personal. The panel highlights a stark, incredibly tragic contrast in how different veterans experience the aftermath of the war.
Right, because combat veterans returning from Europe or the Pacific Theater experience what we typically associate with the post-war era. You know, ticker tape parades, the GI Bill, the economic boom, they were celebrated openly. But the American atomic veterans, the men tasked with the testing, the occupation of devastated cities, the cleanup of highly radioactive sites, they came home to absolute silence.
Their work was classified at the highest levels of national security. They were legally forbidden from speaking about what they had seen, what they had handled, or the radiation they had been exposed to until the secrecy laws were finally lifted in the 1990s.
I just try to imagine carrying that weight. You know, you survived the most horrific conflict in human history, you witnessed the dawn of a weapon that can erase a city in a microsecond, and you can't even explain your nightmares to your spouse.
The documentary illustrates this psychological toll perfectly through the story of Victoria Kelly's grandfather. He was part of the American occupation force in Japan immediately following the bombings.
Yeah.
He returned to New York, and his trauma was so severe, so debilitating, that he couldn't even manage the sensory overload of riding the subway.
He falls into severe alcoholism, which the family attributes directly to his unspoken experiences in Japan. His wife and children suffered immensely. He eventually died from the alcoholism, leaving the family with a profound, confusing bitterness. But there's a detail in this story that is just haunting. During the occupation, his unit would go house to house searching for weapons, and he brought back a Japanese flag.
A practice that was fairly common among occupying forces, though deeply fraught ethically.
Right, and these flags became quite valuable in the decades after the war. His family was struggling, they were on the brink of losing their home, and he was gambling away what little money they had left. But he never sold the flag. He kept it hidden away his entire life.
What does that flag represent to a man in that situation? Was it a trophy of conquest? Or was it a physical reminder of the humanity of the people he had occupied? A tether to the guilt he wasn't allowed to articulate?
We'll never know.
No, the silence imposed by the government ensured his family would never fully know. It speaks to the generational trauma radiating outward from those blasts.
And that fallout isn't confined to the 1940s either. The CFR panel transitions to our current nuclear reality, and the facts they present are terrifying. We tend to view the atomic bomb as a historical artifact, but Elise Rowan from the Nuclear Threat Initiative points out that the doomsday clock currently sits at 85 seconds to midnight. That is the closest to global catastrophe the clock has ever been set.
We are currently living through an era of massive nuclear modernization. The United States, for example, is overhauling its entire nuclear triad, including the construction of 400 new intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. We have to contextualize the destructive power of these modern weapons to really understand the gravity of this.
Put the numbers into perspective for us, because the yield differences are just staggering.
The bomb dropped on Hiroshima, little boy, had a yield of roughly 15 kilotons. Nagasaki was 21 kilotons. Those two singular detonations leveled entire cities and killed hundreds of thousands of people.
Right.
Well, a single modern ICBM warhead averages over 300 kilotons. And a single missile can carry multiple independently targetable warheads. The scale of destruction sitting in silos right now renders the weapons that ended World War II almost microscopic by comparison.
During the panel discussion, there was a fascinating moment of friction. The filmmakers want to leave the audience on a somewhat optimistic note, highlighting the fact that a nuclear weapon hasn't been detonated in warfare since 1945. They suggest that perhaps humanity learned a permanent lesson. But an audience member, a national security consultant, pushes back hard against that framing. She asks, aren't we using them every day? Through diplomacy, through politics, through strategic deterrence.
That is the core reality of the nuclear age. The weapons didn't vanish into a museum. They became the invisible, load-bearing architecture of global security. This is the doctrine of deterrence.
Explain the logic of deterrence for a second, because on the surface, mutually assured destruction, or MAD, sounds like global suicide.
Well, the logic dictates that possessing these weapons and guaranteeing that you will retaliate with overwhelming force if attacked is the only reliable method to prevent an adversary from attacking you in the first place. You ensure that any aggressive act results in the total annihilation of the aggressor. Therefore, a rational actor will never attack.
The paradox is just staggering. To prevent the end of the world, we have to maintain a constant, credible threat to end the world. But what happens when the actor isn't rational? Or, what happens when the system glitches?
That is exactly what Aaron, one of the panel experts, brings up. The modern risk isn't necessarily a calculated, preemptive strike born of geopolitical strategy. The most acute risk is inadvertent escalation.
A catastrophic mistake.
Precisely. The system is designed to respond rapidly. Consider the incident in 1983 with Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. The Soviet early warning systems suddenly reported that 5 American Minuteman ICBMs had been launched and were heading toward the Soviet Union.
The screens are flashing red, the sirens are going off. The system is literally telling him World War III just started.
According to protocol, Petrov was supposed to immediately report the incoming strike up the chain of command, which almost certainly would have resulted in a massive Soviet retaliatory launch before the American missiles even landed.
Right.
But Petrov reasoned that if the U.S. were launching a preemptive strike, they would launch thousands of missiles, not just 5. He gambled the fate of the world on the assumption that the computer was malfunctioning.
And he was right.
He was. The satellite had misinterpreted the sun's reflection off high-altitude clouds as missile launches. But imagine a modern scenario where a U.S. early warning satellite goes down, or the feed is jammed by a cyber attack during a period of high international tension. The military suddenly lacks the connectivity to know for sure what is happening. By law, only one person in the United States makes the decision to launch a nuclear weapon: the president.
And how long do they have to make that call?
Because of the need for an assured second strike, meaning you have to launch your missiles before the incoming warheads destroy your silos, the president would have roughly 30 minutes to absorb the information, consult with advisors, and decide whether to initiate a nuclear holocaust.
30 minutes?
30 minutes, one person. Based on potentially faulty or jammed data, that terrifyingly narrow window of decision-making is the direct legacy of 1945.
Amidst all this tension and terror, there's an anecdote from the panel that offers a glimpse of the opposite end of the human spectrum. An audience member talks about his father, who drove a Coca-Cola delivery truck in California during the early part of the war.
Yes, delivering supplies to the Japanese internment camps.
The U.S. government forcibly relocated and incarcerated American citizens based entirely on their ancestry. It was a dark, incredibly unjust chapter. But this delivery driver engaged with the people in the camps as human beings. And the Japanese citizens, living in these horrific conditions, would craft small, handmade kites out of whatever scraps they could find to give him as gifts.
The panel uses that anecdote to pivot to the post-war occupation in Japan, noting the sheer capacity for grace and forgiveness the Japanese people exhibited toward the Americans.
It seems almost impossible. You drop 2 atomic bombs on a nation, you firebomb their cities, and yet the occupation was relatively peaceful. How does that happen?
As one veteran in the documentary put it, they were simply sick and tired of war. The country was starving. The infrastructure was obliterated. When the Americans arrived not as executioners, but bringing food, medicine, and administrative structure, the basic human instinct for survival, coupled with sheer exhaustion from years of militaristic propaganda and brutal conflict, paved the way for reconciliation rather than insurgency.
It's a true testament to human resilience. But that local reconciliation didn't mean the globe was at peace. The atomic reality we just unpacked naturally froze the world into a state of mutually assured destruction.
Which brings us to the massive geopolitical question. How did the United States and the Soviet Union, who just spent years bleeding together to defeat Nazi Germany, turn their weapons on each other almost the moment the war ended?
To understand the mechanics of that fracture, we rely on our next source, an academic paper by Abraham Kool Nguyen from the University of Juba. He provides a detailed historiography of the Cold War.
Historiography basically meaning the study of how historians study history, how different generations of scholars have tried to make sense of this massive geopolitical chasm.
Exactly. When historians look at the origins of the Cold War, they aren't playing a game of good guys and bad guys, nor are they universally endorsing capitalism over communism. They are analyzing the raw mechanics of statecraft, the motivations of leaders, and how 2 terrified empires misread each other. Nguyen outlines 4 distinct schools of thought that have evolved over the decades. Let's walk through them, because it shows how our understanding of history changes based on the era we live in. First up is the Orthodox view. And just to be clear here, we're not taking a side on any of these political ideologies, capitalism versus communism, or who's to blame between the US and the Soviets. Our goal is strictly to impartially report how historians analyze the motivations laid out in the text.
Absolutely. So, the Orthodox school emerged in the West during the 1950s and 60s, right in the thick of the early Cold War. This perspective places the blame for the conflict squarely on Soviet aggression and expansionism. It views Joseph Stalin as the primary architect of the Iron Curtain.
What specific evidence do Orthodox historians use to support that, though?
They point to the Soviet Union's actions in Eastern Europe immediately after the war. Stalin promised free elections in places like Poland at the Yalta Conference, but then proceeded to install puppet communist regimes, completely crushing democratic opposition.
Right.
The Orthodox view argues that Marxist-Leninist ideology is inherently expansionist, that it requires the eventual overthrow of global capitalism, and therefore, the United States had no choice but to adopt a defensive posture of containment to protect Western Europe.
But history is a moving target. In the late 1960s and 70s, a new generation of historians comes of age. These are scholars who are living through the Vietnam War. They are disillusioned by government secrecy, and they formulate the revisionist view.
Yeah, the revisionists flip the script entirely. They argue that the United States bears the primary responsibility for the Cold War. Their argument centers on the economic and military imbalance at the end of WWII.
How so?
While the Soviet Union had lost over 20 million people, its industry was devastated. The United States, meanwhile, emerged with a booming economy, untouched domestic infrastructure, and a monopoly on the atomic bomb.
So the revisionists argue the U.S. used that monopoly to throw its weight around.
Yes. They argue the U.S. employed atomic diplomacy to intimidate Moscow and force open markets for American capitalist expansion. From the revisionist perspective, Stalin's aggressive moves in Eastern Europe weren't about global conquest at all. They were desperate attempts to secure a geographical buffer zone to protect a shattered Soviet Union from ever being invaded through Germany again.
It's fascinating how the exact same historical events, like Stalin taking over Poland, can be interpreted as either an offensive march toward global domination or a terrified defensive crouch.
which naturally leads to the third school of thought, post-revisionism. This emerged as archives slowly began to open up, and it serves as a sort of synthesis.
Okay.
Post-revisionists argue that the Cold War wasn't the fault of one inherently evil empire or one aggressively capitalist hegemon. It was a profound tragedy of conflicting interests, massive miscommunication, and really poor diplomacy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. There is an analogy for this theory that I think explains the mechanics perfectly. Imagine two people locked inside a pitch-black room. Both of them are heavily armed. Both of them are absolutely terrified of the other.
Right.
One person shifts their weight just to stretch their legs. The other person hears the floorboard creak, assumes they are about to be attacked, and raises their weapon. The first person hears the weapon being raised, assumes they are under attack, and chambers around.
That is the absolute essence of the security dilemma that post-revisionists focus on. Defensive moves are inherently perceived as aggressive acts by the other side. Post-revisionism acknowledges Stalin's brutal paranoia, but also points out that Western leaders like Truman couldn't possibly know Stalin's true intentions, so prudence dictated they assume the worst. The escalation was driven by mutual fear.
And then Nguyen outlines a fourth perspective, which feels almost detached from the human element entirely. The realist school.
Realists look past ideology entirely and focus on the structure of the international system. Prior to WWII, the world was multipolar. Power was balanced among several empires: the British, the French, the Germans, the Japanese.
Right.
World War II destroyed that structure completely.
Yeah.
You were left with only two massive superpowers staring at each other across the globe. A bipolar world.
So, realists argue that conflict was mathematically inevitable.
Correct. It wouldn't have mattered if both nations were capitalist democracies or both were communist.
No.
Two massively powerful states operating in an anarchic international system will always compete for dominance to ensure their own survival.
So we have these two titans locked in this terrifying pitch-black room for over 4 decades. How does the standoff finally end? According to Nguyen's paper, it wasn't a military victory, it was fundamentally an economic collapse. The Soviet Union simply went broke trying to keep up.
The Soviet economy entered a severe period of stagnation in the 1970s and 80s. Their entire state apparatus was oriented outward toward defense and maintaining parity with the West. They were pouring just an astronomical percentage of their gross domestic product into building nuclear warheads and funding proxy wars.
And when you pour all your resources into the military, the domestic front starves.
Exactly. Their domestic infrastructure decayed, industrial innovation ground to a halt. The command economy couldn't efficiently distribute basic goods. I mean, they were building world-class submarines, but their citizens were waiting in line for hours just to buy bread. This led to the insolvency of communist ideology itself. The social contract broke down.
Nguyen points to the specific leadership dynamics in the 1980s as the catalyst that finally shattered the system: Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev.
Reagan adopted a hardline approach, increasing U.S. defense spending and introducing the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. This was a proposed space-based missile defense system. The press called it Star Wars. The idea was to use lasers to shoot down incoming Soviet ICBMs.
Whether SDI was technologically feasible at the time is almost beside the point, though. The psychological impact on the Soviets was devastating.
It really was. If the U.S. could successfully build a shield, the entire concept of mutually assured destruction would be neutralized, rendering the massive Soviet nuclear arsenal basically useless. And the Soviets knew they did not have the economic or technological capacity to build a countermeasure.
So Gorbachev realizes the arms race is unwinnable, the domestic economy is a disaster, and he initiates massive, sudden reforms to try and save the state. Perestroika and glasnost.
Right. Perestroika meant the restructuring of the rigid economic system, trying to introduce elements of market efficiency. Glasnost meant openness and transparency, relaxing the strict censorship that had defined the Soviet regime for decades.
But you can't partially open a pressure cooker.
No, you can't. Once citizens were allowed to speak openly without fear of the Gulag, the pent-up grievances of decades poured out. The system lost its monopoly on truth, and the structural integrity of the entire Eastern Bloc disintegrated rapidly. Nguyen refers to this as a necessary paradigm shift in Soviet policy, a realization by Gorbachev that national security couldn't be achieved through weapons alone, but required human cooperation and integration with the global economy.
It's an incredible geopolitical arc. But I want to pull us back to the immediate aftermath of 1945. Because while the US and the Soviets were busy descending into that pitch-black room to start the Cold War, the global community had a massive, immediate problem staring them right in the face.
What to do with the physical architects of the Holocaust and the aggression of World War II?
Right. You can't just sweep the hot war under the rug, aim missiles at Moscow, and pretend the atrocities didn't happen. But here's the massive legal headache. In 1945, there was no international penal code. There was no world government to call the police. That brings us to our next source, Mary Jean Lopardo's analysis of the Nuremberg trials and the unprecedented architecture of international justice.
The Allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union convened in London in August 1945. They established the International Military Tribunal, the IMT, with the explicit goal of trying and punishing the major Axis war criminals.
They indicted 22 major Nazi defendants, men like Hermann Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, and Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the armed forces. And the charges were broken down into three main categories.
Crimes against peace, which involved the actual planning and waging of a war of aggression. War crimes, which are the traditional violations of the customs of war, murdering prisoners of war, plundering occupied territory. And finally, crimes against humanity, a relatively new legal concept designed to address the sheer scale of the Holocaust murder, extermination, enslavement, and deportation on political, racial, or religious grounds.
On the surface, prosecuting these men seems like an obvious moral imperative. But Lopardo's article dives into the intense legal pushback the IMT faced at the time. Prominent scholars and politicians argue the trials were fundamentally flawed. Let me play devil's advocate for a second, because this is the core tension of Nuremberg. If there is no global statute book, weren't the Allies just making up the rules after the fact? Weren't they essentially saying, we won the war, therefore we have the authority to legally execute you?
This raises an important question, and it is the exact criticism leveled against the tribunal, that they were administering ex post facto law, retroactive law. The fundamental principle of justice in most legal systems is that a person cannot be punished for an act if that act wasn't officially declared a crime at the time they committed it.
Even prominent American politicians were uneasy about it. Republican Senator Robert A. Taft actually called the trials a blot on American jurisprudence because it violated that core constitutional principle.
So the IMT had to build a legal foundation from scratch to rebut that. How do you justify hanging a man for violating a law that wasn't codified with a specific penalty? They leaned heavily on international treaties that Germany had already voluntarily signed. The primary anchor was the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928.
What exactly did that pact say?
63 nations, including Germany, signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which explicitly condemned recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounced it as an instrument of national policy.
Okay, but it didn't have a penal code attached to it. It didn't say, if you start a war, the leaders go to prison for life.
It didn't. But the IMT argued that the pact unequivocally established the principle that aggressive war was illegal. They argued that it would be a far greater injustice to let these massive violations of a signed international treaty go unpunished simply because the specific penal mechanisms hadn't been formalized yet.
I mean, that makes sense.
But they didn't stop at treaties. They delved deep into the philosophical and historical foundations of law to prove they weren't inventing these concepts out of thin air.
Lopardo's article gets into the long history of the just war theory. The tribunal referenced thinkers like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Hugo Grotius to prove that humanity had long recognized aggressive war as immoral and illegal.
St. Augustine wrote in The City of God centuries ago that wars fought merely for dominion, for crushing neighbors and expanding territory, are nothing more than robbery on a grand scale. He posited that only self-defense constitutes a just war.
And St. Thomas Aquinas expanded on that, right? He laid out specific criteria.
Yes. Aquinas argued that for a war to be just, it must meet three conditions. First, it must have proper authority. It can't just be a private militia. Second, it must have a just cause, meaning the nation being attacked must deserve it because of some fault. And third, it must have the right intention, meaning the ultimate objective must be the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil, leading to a lasting peace.
The IMT also brought up Hugo Grotius.
Grotius is widely considered the father of international law. In the 1600s, he argued that natural law, the dictate of right, reason, dictates that unprovoked aggression is inherently unlawful. The IMT utilized all this intellectual history to say, look, the prohibition against aggressive war isn't a new rule we just invented because we won. It is the foundational consensus of human civilization.
But the defendants had other legal shields, right? They argued the active state doctrine. They claimed they weren't acting as individual men, they were acting as instruments of the sovereign state of Germany. The argument is that you can punish this state, but you can't hang an individual for a state policy.
The tribunal soundly rejected that, and the reasoning is crucial for modern international law. The IMT chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, pointed out that crimes against international law are committed by men, not by abstract entities.
Because you can't put a nation in a jail cell.
Exactly. If you only punish the abstract state, for example, by imposing massive, crippling financial reparations, you don't deter the leaders, you just punish the general population. That breeds deep resentment. That is exactly what happened after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. The crushing economic penalties placed on Germany helped fuel the populist anger that Hitler rode to power. The IMT argued you must pierce the veil of state sovereignty and hold the individual malefactors accountable to break the cycle.
Which brings us to the final, most infamous defense used at Nuremberg, superior orders, the "I was just following orders" defense.
The defense attorneys argued that military discipline requires absolute obedience. If a soldier or a lower-level official refuses a direct order from the state, they face anarchy, or they get court-martialed and shot by their own commanders. How can you hold a man legally culpable when his life was on the line if he disobeyed?
How did the tribunal dismantle that?
They established a new global standard. The IMT ruled that the defense of superior orders is completely void when the orders are so patently barbarous and unlawful that any rational individual must have realized they violated the basic tenets of humanity.
Give me an example of how that applies to the Holocaust specifically.
Lepardo points out a chilling reality about the Nazi regime. The Holocaust wasn't carried out by soldiers in the heat of battle panicking under the threat of a commanding officer's pistol. The genocide was meticulously planned. The Nazis kept voluminous bureaucratic records of their slaughters. Officials calculated train schedules to the death camps. They calculated the exact amount of Zyklon B gas required per cubic meter.
It was an administrative process.
Exactly. Men were sitting at desks far removed from any physical threat to their own lives, optimizing the efficiency of mass murder to prove their loyalty and ensure their own political advancement within the party. The tribunal ruled that no one can claim they were merely following orders when participating in a systemic, bureaucratic machine of genocide.
That ruling is a massive paradigm shift in human history. It established the revolutionary precedent that individual morality must supersede state law. If your government orders you to commit an atrocity, international law expects you to defy your own government.
It laid the foundation for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the architecture of modern international law that we live under today.
But as much as we attempt to legislate our way out of the horrors of the 1940s, as much as we build tribunals and sign treaties to govern human behavior, there is a massive legacy of World War II that doesn't care about the Kellogg-Briand Pact or the Geneva Conventions.
You were talking about the physical Earth.
I am. We've discussed the technological leaps in our kitchens, the psychological toll of the atomic age, the geopolitical maps of the Cold War, the legal frameworks of Nuremberg. But the final lingering legacy of WWII isn't found in a textbook or a museum. It is literally rotting at the bottom of the ocean.
This brings us to our final source, the incredibly striking art and science portfolio by Robertina Ebjani. Her work forces us to confront the subaquatic, ecological scars left by human conflict.
Her project, Echoes of the Abyss, is absolutely haunting. It focuses on the reality of UXO unexploded ordnance. After the world wars ended, the victorious nations had millions of tons of surplus chemical weapons, conventional bombs, and artillery shells. Instead of safely dismantling them, which was expensive and dangerous, they chose the cheapest disposal method possible. They loaded them onto ships and dumped them into the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, and the Adriatic Sea.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. The assumption was that the ocean was so vast it would simply dilute any danger. But Ebjani's work highlights the reality of physics and chemistry.
Metal casings do not last forever in salt water. 80 years later, the thin metal skins on these munitions are rusting away. They are actively decaying right now, releasing incredibly toxic payloads like mustard gas, arsenic, and TNT degradation products directly into the marine environment.
Abjani spent time aboard the Tara research vessel, collaborating directly with marine biologists who are studying this exact phenomenon. And the art she creates from this data illustrates how these chemicals are drastically altering the seawater composition and threatening the biodiversity of the reefs.
What makes this so terrifying is that it isn't a historical event we can study in retrospect. It is an unfolding, escalating ecological catastrophe. As the mustard gas leaks out, it reacts with the seawater. In some cases, it polymerizes into these sticky, toxic lumps that wash up on beaches looking like amber. Marine organisms absorb the heavy metals and arsenic.
It enters the food web.
It enters the food web, it mutates cellular structures, and it disrupts the reproductive cycles of marine life. It is a process she touches on in her broader concept of aquaforming.
Aquaforming, like the sci-fi concept of terraforming a planet, but we're doing it to our own water.
Precisely. In her projects Aquaforensic and Aquatocene, she explores how anthropogenic waste, human-created waste, is completely redesigning aquatic habitats. It's not just the rusting bombs, it's pharmaceutical pollutants. It's the intense underwater acoustic noise pollution from global shipping routes and military sonar, which causes physical trauma to marine mammals that rely on echolocation. We are reshaping the ocean's chemistry and acoustic environment to reflect our own toxicity.
She had these two other fascinating works in the portfolio, Echinoidea Future and Aurelia 1+ Hertz.
Echinoidea Future focuses on sea urchins. It examines how agricultural runoff and liquid waste are lowering the oxygen levels in the sea, creating these massive hypoxic dead zones where creatures like sea urchins are literally suffocating in their own habitats.
And Aurelia 1+ Hertz is this wild conceptual piece. She explores the biocybernetics of jellyfish. She creates an installation where a living jellyfish and a simple robotic entity interact in the same tank.
She uses the jellyfish, an organism that has existed for millions of years and possesses incredible regenerative capabilities, to explore concepts of life prolongation. But more importantly, the interaction with the machine is a vehicle to explore interspecies empathy. She is asking us to consider our relationship with the biological systems we are currently destroying.
So what does this all mean? When we look at Abjani's portfolio, what is a core takeaway for us?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, her work forces us to realize that history is not safely trapped in the past. It is actively, chemically breaking down in our waters today. At Nuremberg, we established a monumental legal framework to protect humans from the atrocities of other humans. But who protects the more than human entities, the marine life, the complex ecosystems, from the weapons we indiscriminately discarded?
It's a tragic realization. You have acts of human greed, fear, and warfare from 80 years ago that are currently poisoning sea urchins and mutating jellyfish and the Adriatic sea creatures that have absolutely nothing to do with human politics or our ideological squabbles.
It demands a total reevaluation of accountability. Our legal frameworks, our treaties, our historical narratives, they all center on human victims. But the Earth itself, the biosphere, is a direct casualty of World War II, and it is still actively bleeding from the wounds we inflicted in 1945.
I want you, the listener, to just imagine the ocean for a second. We usually think of it as a natural resource, a place to go sailing, or a pristine ecosystem. But Abjani's work asks us to view it as a fluid archive. It is a literal liquid museum of humanity's most toxic legacies. And we are forcing marine life to inhabit our museum of horrors.
It is a profoundly sobering perspective that completely recontextualizes our relationship with history.
It really is. And brings us full circle on this massive journey we've taken today. We started in the absolute mundane comfort of our kitchens, unpacking how the cavity magnetron that powers our microwaves and the ENIAC vacuum tubes that evolved into our smartphones were forged out of the desperate necessity to hunt submarines and calculate artillery trajectories.
We moved from those conveniences to the terrifying specter of the atomic age, examining the generational, unspoken trauma of the atomic veterans and the incredibly fragile reality of a modern world held in check by the paradox of nuclear deterrence and a 30-minute window for catastrophic error.
We navigated the ideological battlegrounds of the Cold War, exploring how historians dissect the motivations of empires, how a move can be seen as global conquest or terrified defense, depending on who is standing in the pitch-black room. We saw the very foundation of modern international justice being laid at Nuremberg, born from the realization that we cannot allow state bureaucracy to excuse unconscionable acts of mass murder.
And finally, we sank to the bottom of the ocean, where the rusting bombs of the 1940s are still leaking poison into the water, serving as a silent chemical reminder that our actions leave scars far beyond our own lifespans and our own species.
World War II built the architecture of the modern world, for better and for worse. Every single time you heat up a cup of coffee, or check a weather app, or read about an international war crimes tribunal, or look out over the vastness of the ocean, you're looking directly at the echoing legacies of that conflict.
The past isn't just something we study. It is baked into the physical and legal infrastructure of our daily reality.
Which leaves me with a final thought I want you to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We've spent all this time dissecting how the radar technologies, the geopolitical decisions, and the discarded weapons of the 1940s are still chemically altering our seas and dictating our international laws today, more than 8 decades later. So, take a hard look at the world right now. Look at our current technological races, our modern geopolitical conflicts, our current environmental decisions. What invisible, echoing legacies are we currently laying down for the year 2100? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.